Now let's create a GitHub Actions workflow that will build and deploy the code. We could do that from inside GitHub, but the easiest way is to let Azure App Service do it for us. So let's go back to the Azure portal and down to the list of app services and open the app service we want to set up for continuous deployment with GitHub. Now, rather than deploy directly to the main app service URL that users are accessing, which is really the production deployment slot, let's set this up to deploy to the development deployment slot we created earlier in the course. I'll navigate into that deployment slot, which, remember, has its own URL and configuration. Let's go to the Deployment Center inside this development deployment slot. And let's select the source for the deployment, which will be GitHub this time. If Azure didn't detect that I was already logged into GitHub, I'd be presented with a button to authorize Azure to communicate with GitHub, which is just an OAuth 2.0 authentication flow. But since I'm already logged in, I can select my organization in GitHub and select the repository we want to deploy from, which is this one where we push the code, and select the branch in the GitHub repo that we want to deploy from. Next, we want to choose the authentication method for GitHub to use when pushing the deployment files to Azure App Service. The recommended option is for GitHub to leverage a user-assigned identity. This is an identity created in Microsoft Entra ID and federated with GitHub. So the authentication will take place using a temporary token generated for the OAuth 2.0 protocol. The other option is to use basic authentication, which just copies the publish profile XML file to GitHub, which has a username and password. If we look at the preview file, this is the GitHub Actions workflow file that will get generated in GitHub. We'll look at this more closely when we go into GitHub, but the important part right now is the action at the bottom, deploy to Azure Web App. GitHub Actions are pre-built code components that accept inputs. So this action is called Web Apps-deploy, and the parameters are the name of the app service, the slot name, the package to deploy, and this period just means that the package was generated earlier in the workflow and stored at the root of the folder. And the publish profile parameter references the publish profile that was copied from Azure and stored in a section of GitHub called GitHub Secrets. I'll show you that shortly. This basic authentication approach is the original way for GitHub Actions to deploy to App Service, and it's still a valid option. But obviously, not storing passwords in GitHub would be considered more secure. So let's look at the other option, user-assigned identity. Here we can choose an existing managed identity or generate a new one. The preview file is pretty much the same as before, except for the input parameters to the Web Apps deploy action. It doesn't use a profile because the workflow now has another task just before, which logs into Azure, using some new GitHub secrets related to the user-assigned identity. So there's no actual password being stored in this case. So let's go with this option. But I'll warn you that there is a bit of a bug in this currently, and it only applies when we're doing this from a deployment slot. If you did this from the root production slot, everything would be fine and the code would deploy. But doing this from a deployment slot, this GitHub Actions workflow is actually going to fail. But it's an easy fix, and the debugging process will help you understand how the authentication actually works. So let's keep user-assigned identity and save these changes. It says App Service is setting up GitHub Action build and deployment pipeline. Let's go back to GitHub and to the root of the code folder. I'll just refresh the page. And now there's a folder created, .github/workflows. This is where the GitHub Actions workflow files are stored. This YML file is the actual workflow. The YML extension stands for YAML, which is the markup language used by GitHub Actions workflows. So this is the same file you saw previewed in Azure. I'll go through this in more detail shortly, but notice these values for the Azure login action. These values are stored in GitHub Secrets for this repository. If I go up to the menu at the top and click Settings, under Secrets and Variables, click the link for the secrets used by GitHub Actions. Here are the 3 secrets that were created by App Service during provisioning of the GitHub Actions workflow. There's an Edit button, but you can't actually see the values once they're created. You can only overwrite them with a new value. Okay, when the workflow file was created, that actually triggered the workflow to run because it's considered a change to the source files. Let's go to the Actions tab and watch the workflow running. You can see there was a commit push to GitHub that triggered the workflow to run. If I click on the workflow, you can see there are two steps, build and deploy. Let's watch the build step. Each of these steps corresponds to an action in the workflow file, and this is the output from those actions. First, the job is set up, which involves provisioning a runner from the pool, which is a VM that the build runs on. Then the source code is checked out of GitHub repository and copied onto the runner. Next, the necessary runtime is configured. In this case, a PowerShell file is run to set up the correct version of .NET Core. Next, a .NET CLI command is run to build the code. Then a command is run to publish the code, which puts together a set of publish files into a package that can be deployed, like we did manually in the previous module. And then the package is uploaded to GitHub Artifacts, which is a central location for temporarily storing the package. And that's because each job in a GitHub Actions workflow runs on a different VM or runner. So the deploy job will need to download that package. So now that the build job is complete, let's watch the deploy job. It's waiting for a runner or VM to pick up this job. So a VM has been provisioned for the job, and next there's a pre-login to Azure task. Then a deployment package is downloaded onto this runner VM from GitHub Artifacts. And next, GitHub Actions will log into Azure using the user-assigned managed identity. This is where things are going to fail. And this is because we had Azure create the GitHub Actions workflow from a deployment slot. And again, this is just a bug in the current process. It's an easy fix, and I'll walk you through that in the next clip.